Hello, I'm going to discuss the use of AI algorithms in the criminal justice system, and particularly in criminal sentencing. My name is Bingham, and this is my capstone presentation for Eastern University's DTSC 690 course. I have a question. Is it ethical and constitutional to use black box algorithms for criminal sentencing? I want to explore a few points to help answer that. First, if you haven't seen the movie Minority Report, pause this video and go watch it. It's a great science fiction film that explores the concept of being able to predict a crime before it happens and arresting the perpetrator before they can commit the act. We don't have precogs today, but we do have AI algorithms that we use in the criminal justice system. Some uses of these models involve crime forecasting, criminal enforcement response, and criminal sentencing. Crime forecasting algorithms use social media posts, 3D recognition software, public data sets containing time and geographical locations in which crimes have been previously committed, and facial recognition programs. This data is used to find patterns in crimes in order to predict crime type and location. AI models are also used for crime enforcement response. These types of algorithms are focused on how to best utilize the police workforce. They help police see trends in location and type of crime in order to create a police presence where those algorithms predict they are most needed. Police also used facial recognition software to identify suspects. Although we can easily see potential bias in using predictive algorithms for geographic locations of where crimes are more likely to be committed, and also the perpetuation of a potentially flawed response system, I would like to focus on the third type of criminal justice AI use, which is impacted by the first two, criminal sentencing. This use of AI model is, in my opinion, the most controversial for making criminal predictions. Risk assessment tools have been developed all over the United States and other countries as well to make decisions in allowing probation, to assist in determining if a convicted person should have treatment and the kinds of treatment they would need, to allow a defendant pre-trial release, reducing a prison sentence, and to assign the length of a prison sentence. In order to explain why this is such a controversial area, let me explain the background of this particular use of AI in criminal justice. In short, machine learning models are used to determine recidivism. Judges will use a risk assessment tool that aids in assigning the length of the sentence delivered to the person assessed. When these kinds of risk assessment models were first developed, they were not intended to be used in sentencing. They were instead intended to aid a judge in knowing what kind of treatment or services to give to people eligible for parole to increase their success and reduce the risk of reoffending. The purpose was essentially to promote rehabilitation instead of recidivism. If people were given access to drug and alcohol treatment or counseling, they would be more likely to achieve rehabilitation instead of re-incarceration. This focus had several interests in mind: the best interest of the person who committed the crime, a community of reduced crime, and the issue of the overcrowded jails and prisons. The people who developed Compass, the most widely used risk assessment tool for criminal sentencing, were Tim Brennan and Dave Wells. Brennan was a University of Colorado statistics professor, and Wells ran a corrections program in Michigan. Together, they founded North Point in 1989. They started working on a classification model that would explore the primary theories about what causes crime. Brennan had no intention of having this tool used for sentencing at all. Also, since their model was a privately developed algorithm, it is protected by trade secret laws, and the inner workings are shielded from the users or the people they affect, even from judges. As time went on, the use of Compass and other risk assessment tools started changing. Recidivism became a hot topic and jails became incredibly overcrowded. Instead of reevaluating the tool itself, the scope of use started to creep. In 2002, these AI models began being used for the sentencing of nonviolent criminals. In 2016, there was the important case of State versus Loomis. Loomis was convicted of a crime, and his Compass score was used to aid the judge in a sentence. Loomis filed 2 motions contesting this. He claimed his right to due process had been violated not only because he could not see the Compass report that assisted in his sentence due to trade secret laws, which infringed on his right to an individualized sentence and his right to be sentenced on accurate information, but also that it was unconstitutional to use a risk assessment tool for sentencing that took into account his gender. His motions were denied, and this was a big step in the criminal justice system having license to use these risk assessment tools as is for sentencing purposes. Today, these black box algorithms are used as a tool to predict future crimes and to prevent the accused from having the ability to reoffend. This reminds me of the line in the beginning of Minority Report, when a man was arrested before committing a crime the precogs predicted he would commit. He is being arrested, and he yells, "But I didn't do anything. I wasn't going to do anything." Our present-day precogs prevent us from ever knowing whether or not this is true. Incapacitation prevents the ability to commit future crimes. Let's take a further look at what might be inside these algorithms as far as we are able to see. Since the risk assessment models are black box algorithms, only the developers are able to know exactly how they work and the weights assigned to each variable. We can, however, have an idea of the variables they contain from those who have filled out the questionnaires. It is illegal for risk assessments to directly ask about race, color, creed, and religion, among other things, but the algorithms can contain proxies that serve as measurements for these characteristics that cannot be directly measured. Other questions use proxies for making estimations of a greater construct that isn't measurable. Even if intelligence, introversion, criminal personality, and stability were things proven to predict future criminal behavior, they are not things that can be easily measured or measured directly. The model additionally asks questions that are completely out of a person's control or are very subjective, like asking if a family member had ever been to jail, if an acquaintance uses illegal drugs, or if the person considers themselves dangerous if others make them lose their temper. On top of this, the developers of these algorithms are the only ones who know how much weight each question has in the model. The data collection portion of the model development process alone contains several types of bias. After the assessment has been taken, the model generates a single number between 1 and 10 to determine if you are low risk, medium risk, or high risk of recidivism. The higher the number, the more likely you will receive a longer sentence. These AI models and their use is controversial on many levels. One of these is the fact that discrimination is built into them. If a defendant is Black, under 25 years of age, or female, they will most likely receive a higher risk score and a harsher sentence. If the defendant is a white male over 25, not only will they be much more likely to receive a lower risk score, but the model is also more likely to mislabel them as low risk. A study done by ProPublica found that Compass was predicting violent crimes unreliably. Only 20% of the people predicted to commit violent crimes actually went on to do so. They also discovered that Black defendants have twice the likelihood of being labeled as high risk than white defendants, and white defendants are more likely to be mislabeled as low risk than Black defendants. So now we know that these models are protected black boxes. They are used for purposes they weren't designed to be used for. They have a high error rate, and they reveal race and gender bias. Additionally, there are other factors included in producing a risk score that are beyond the defendant's control, such as geography, family background, and employment status. When all these things are taken into account, the model has been shown to have a 60% accuracy to predict recidivism. Isn't that slightly better than a coin toss? The bias built into these risk assessments needs to be discovered and mitigated, not only because of the racial and gender bias exhibited, but also to evaluate the impacts of the false negatives and false positives being generated. What is worse, generating a false negative or a false positive? The impacts are far-reaching, and there is no way mathematically to correct for false positive error rates and false negative error rates at the same time. I want to bring up another issue that needs to be considered: due process. This is the process that protects the defendant's rights when sentenced for a criminal charge. Due process is intended to provide a fair legal proceeding for the accused. The defendant has the legal right to access the information used to determine their sentence. Black box algorithms that produce a risk score to aid in determining a sentence prevent the defendant from both seeing how that score was reached or even from seeing what that score was. The judges don't even know how the score was produced. In the case of State versus Loomis, Justice Ann Walsh Bradley stated, "You're identified through the Compass assessment as an individual who is at high risk to the community." However, the judges, attorneys, and Loomis himself were not allowed to access the methodology on how he received a high-risk score. Since we know that these risk score algorithms were originally designed to provide the rehabilitation resources, and we know from historical data that longer sentences do not prevent future crimes, we cannot say that the use of risk assessment scores in sentencing helps anyone. In fact, it hinders rehabilitation, which puts both the defendant and the community in jeopardy. So what are the effects of using risk assessment algorithms for sentencing? For obvious starters, they affect the defendant by denying them pretrial release, by assigning longer than average sentences, and they can even steer a judge towards a wrongful conviction and assign a lifelong criminal record to the defendant. This in turn provides significant difficulties in finding housing and work, which would perpetuate the system, since these are factors that determine someone's likelihood of committing a crime in the first place. Do you see the cycle of contradictory logic? Historically, there has been a long and complicated relationship between crime, demographics, and police response, and it differs from neighborhood to neighborhood. In many areas, there have been biases in law enforcement itself, districts that are over-policed, and groups of people that are arrested more than others. Crime prediction algorithms do not account for this complexity that police response presents. If a defendant lives in an area where Black people are much more likely to be stopped by the police than white people, they are in turn more likely to have a criminal record, which would then result in a higher recidivism score on a risk assessment. This alone creates a racial bias that affects a risk score and likely a judge's decision, contributing to the perpetuation of a flawed system. Situations like this are called runaway feedback loops. Andrew Lee Park sums up this problem perfectly in his paper, In Law Meets World, when he states, historic biases are reflected in an algorithm's result, further skewing data against marginalized groups, which is then processed again by algorithms to produce even more biased results. Using historical data to build these models is using historical bias. In low-income and minority communities, over-policing and sometimes targeting has long been a problem. To use this historical data to build a model is to take a correlation and turn it into a false causation. This not only perpetuates a flawed system, but it exacerbates it and turns needs into risks. Kathy O'Neill, a renowned mathematician and data scientist, accurately labels this type of model as a weapon of math destruction. So far, we've discussed the three main areas in which AI algorithms are used in the criminal justice system, with a deeper dive into criminal sentencing models. We discussed their intent and what they were originally designed to do, and how the use has changed due to changing legal and societal factors. We've discussed some of the data that is fed into these models, the biases involved, and the impacts of how these algorithms are currently being used. Now let's talk about some real-life results. First, let's look at two similar charges of petty theft. Risha Borden was picking up her godsister with her friend Sadie Jones on foot, and they were running late. They found a bike and a scooter laying outside and tried to use them. The bike and scooter were too small for the girls, so they were getting off when they were stopped by a woman who informed them that the bike and scooter belonged to her 6-year-old son. Risha and Sadie left the items alone and walked away. However, the police had already been called by an onlooker, and the girls were arrested and given a charge of burglary and petty theft for the items that had a total value of $60. Algorithms that predict the likelihood of committing future crimes assigned a high-risk score of 8 to Risha Borden. Sadie Jones was assigned a medium-risk score. The girls spent 2 nights in jail before being let out on bond. They actually never ended up committing any future crimes. Jones has mentioned the difficulty in finding work now. She has been turned away from McDonald's and a dollar store due to her criminal record. Within that same year, Vernon Prater was also charged with petty theft after shoplifting tools from a hardware store. In contrast, Prater already had a criminal record of multiple armed robberies and had spent 5 years in prison. Prater was assessed with the same model and was assigned a low-risk score of 3. Within 2 years, he was arrested again. He is currently in prison with an 8-year sentence for breaking and entering and grand theft. Let's look at shoplifting charges. James Ravelli was arrested for stealing from a drugstore. He had a prior record of domestic violence, aggravated assault, grand theft, petty theft, and drug trafficking. A risk assessment was performed and he received a low-risk score of 3. In less than a year, he was charged with 2 more counts of shoplifting. Robert Cannon was also charged with shoplifting. He had 1 prior conviction of petty theft and was assigned a medium risk score of 6. He has not been convicted of any crimes since. Maybe petty theft and shoplifting are too similar, and the algorithm considers factors, although unknown to us, that would cause this gross miscalculation. I'll look at a different type of crime, DUI. Gregory Lugo was convicted of a DUI. He had 3 prior DUIs on his record, as well as a battery charge. His risk assessment was the lowest number possible, 1. He did, however, manage to commit 2 later crimes of domestic violence and battery. Mallory Williams was also arrested for DUI. She had 2 prior misdemeanors and was assigned a risk score of 6, yet did not go on to reoffend. Let's examine drug possession charges. Dylan Fugate was assessed at a low risk of 3 after being arrested for drug possession and having a prior offense of attempted burglary. He has since accumulated 3 more drug possession charges. Bernard Parker, also arrested for drug possession and having 1 prior charge of resisting arrest without violence, was assigned the maximum high score of 10. He has not committed any crimes since. We cannot see how these risk assessment tools work, nor can we know how much weight a judge gives them when determining a sentence. These examples could be exceptions to the rule. One thing we do know, though, is that these risk score assessment tools are used all over the country and could become mandatory very soon, pending a Congress sentencing reform bill. Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella offers 3 very important approaches to AI that I believe could help resolve many of the issues with using risk scores for criminal sentencing. 1, it should assist human decision-making instead of replacing it. 2, there should be accountability and transparency to build trust. And 3, it should respect everyone with inclusive technology. Thank you for listening to my presentation. The following page contains my sources.